I call the Minister and Member for Baulkham Hills.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise not only as the member for Baulkham Hills, but also the Minister for Veterans Affairs and indeed a former member of the Australian Defence Force. I rise on this very special day because it is the 75th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. This is a day that we sacrifice and commemorate. We commemorate the service and sacrifice of Australian prisoners of war. This morning I was at the Cenotaph with the Governor, where we held a solemn ceremony. It remembers a 75th anniversary of the fall of Singapore and the inhumanity of its aftermath. It remembers the struck fear that was into the heart of every Australian, remembers the carnage of the Pacific Theatre, and it remembers the shattered perception that Australia had in its time of isolation, where there was no further guarantee of security. Mr Deputy Speaker, throughout 1940 and 1941, the world was preoccupied with the war against fascism in Europe and North Africa, with only a single division, the 8th Division, retained and sent into the Pacific. Originally intended for deployment to the Middle East by early 1941, with the looming possibility of war with Japan, the 8th Division went sent to Malaya, and on the 2nd of February 1941, it arrived. On the 8th of December 1941, at dawn, Japanese forces invaded Malaysia, with landings on the northeastern coast of the Malay Peninsula at Kota Buru. An hour later, on the other side of the world, Japanese naval forces attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. On the 31st of January 1942, after a courageous fighting effort, the 8th Division was forced to retreat to the island of Singapore, and just 8 days later, using heavy artillery barrage, Japanese began their assault on the island. Staring into the eye of inevitable defeat and facing with the suffering of 1 million civilians and refugees, General Percival, the senior British commander, ordered his troops to cease hostilities at 8:30 on the 15th of February 1942. The defeat signalled a shift away the way Australia approached its defence. When Prime Minister John Curtin addressed the nation a day later, he remarked that, quote, "The protection of this country is no longer that of a contribution to a world war, but the resistance to an enemy threatening to invade our shore. While we would continue to fight alongside our allies in battles to come, Australia was also faced with the need to put up a bulwark against those who sought to denigrate our way of life from the north." I commend the bravery of approximately 1,800 Australian soldiers who were killed or listed as missing in action as a result of the defeat. But today I also want to shine a light on the unimaginable cruelty endured by those men and women of the 8th Division who were interned as prisoners of war and pushed to their breaking point through torture, forced labour, malnutrition and disease. The end of the campaign in Malaya and Singapore was overshadowed by the imprisonment of 130,000 British and Commonwealth troops, 15,000 of which were Australian. We also remember the 32 Australian nurses who withstood horrific conditions in civilian internment camps in Sumatra after the sinking of the SS Vina Brook, which carried 65 Australian nurses, as well as the deaths of the remaining 33 who perished during the sinking or were shot and killed at Raji Beach. We cannot think of these inconceivable sacrifices as horrors confined to the pages of history, but rather as an enduring effort to protect the freedoms we so often take for granted. The defeat and its consequences have had a defining impact on the way Australia saw its strategic interests and its role in the region for the past 3/4 of a century. On behalf of all members, I'm proud to acknowledge and thank those who sacrificed their lives and their liberty for Australia, and for those who are forever indebted. Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to congratulate the way that the 8th Division Association held this last of their solemn ceremonies today. It is very sad to think that on the 75th anniversary the government had to give an epilogue noting that this would be the 8th Division Association's last commemoration of the fall of Singapore. I would also be remiss of me not to add that at a time when the RSL is going through deep and divided investigations into the way it's being operated, that I was delighted to this morning commemorate privately with Glenn Colmetz, the General Manager of the RSL, who was also very much aware of the sacrifice that was made by the men and women who are still members of his organisation. I know on behalf of all members of this House we wish Glenn every success as he reforms the RSL and brings it back to the organisation that it's meant to be, and that's defending the veterans' honour, welfare and honouring their sacrifice are the reasons why the RSL has been around for 100 years today. Thank you.
I call the Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr Speaker, I join with my friend the Minister to mark the 75th anniversary of the fall of Singapore and note that there was a commemorative ceremony in Martin Place at 11 a.m. today. The fall of Singapore was the most significant military loss in modern history and holds special significance for Australians. With Singapore captured, the war had come much closer to Australia. This anniversary recognises that some 21,000 Australian military personnel became prisoners of war and would face 3.5 years of captivity in places, the names of which are now infamously etched into our history, such as Changi, the Burma Railway and, of course, Sandakan. Today, we can note that the majority of personnel came from the 8th Division, as mentioned by the Minister. And today, the 75th anniversary in Sydney will mark the final gathering of the Divisions Association, and the conclusion of the service and its organisational banner will be folded for the last time, as the association will then cease to exist. I, of course, acknowledge that today we saw the guest speaker at this ceremony was Lieutenant Colonel Neil James, retired former Director of the Australian Defence Force Association. I thank the Minister for his statement.